Welcome to the deep dive. Today we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources that, well, they consistently challenge some of the big narratives we've been told over the last few years.
That's right. We're focusing on some of those lone voices who were questioning the consensus during these major global shifts.
And our deep dive today synthesizes material across three main areas.
Right. First, we're looking at the medical consensus during the pandemic. Second, the financial incentives that were, driving some of those health policies.
And third, some of the more current controversies around things like immigration, welfare, and personal freedoms.
Our whole mission here is to provide you, the listener, with the context you need to connect these seemingly separate dots.
Exactly. We'll be unpacking some pretty stunning things. I mean, the denial of natural immunity, the bizarre economics of big banks, even how an old movie about cannabis is still influencing policy.
It's all about spotting the patterns. Okay, so let's unpack this. Where should we start?
I think we have to start where all the friction began, right? The global health crisis.
And when you review the sources on the pandemic, one of the first things that jumps out is the handling of children in schools.
That's right. Because the core data, the actual information, was available so quickly.
Incredibly quickly. We're talking within the first couple of weeks in China, it was known that children just weren't getting dangerously sick.
And the sources emphasize this point. I mean, virtually no child without a serious underlying health issue died. For most kids, it was a pretty mild illness.
And yet that information was largely ignored. Instead, we saw these prolonged school closures all over the world.
You can just look at the comparison, right? Like Sweden?
Exactly. Sweden largely left its schools open, and their overall death rates, in the end, were statistically very similar to countries with hard lockdowns.
With the mortality really hitting the older or, high-risk adult populations.
And the justification for closing the schools, the idea that children would infect their grandparents.
It just didn't hold water. The argument in the sources is that if containment was the goal, it failed. Because at the end of the day, pretty much everybody got it anyway.
And this leads directly to one of the most criticized positions from public health officials, which was the denial of natural immunity.
Right. Dr. Fauci repeatedly said that if you'd been infected before, that wouldn't reliably protect you.
Which is just, it's stunning when you look at the history of medicine.
Wait, so how did we lose knowledge that's been around for literally millennia? Is there a historical counterpoint to that?
Oh, absolutely. The source brings up epidemiologist Martin Kulldorff, who points out the irony. He says we've known about lasting immunity since the Athenian plague in 436 BC.
436 BC.
Yeah, and he says this knowledge was basically lost until very recently. The point is, historically, natural immunity has always been a massive factor in protection.
And the science for coronavirus immunity specifically was already there before 2020, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, get this. Survivors of the original SARS from 2003, they still had T cells and immunity 17 years later. And the most dramatic example, there was a 102-year-old woman who survived the Spanish flu as a baby. 100 years later, she still had antibodies.
So the evidence was always there, and the observation was that a second infection was almost always much, much less severe.
Right, which indicates your cellular immunity is working perfectly. This all ties into the controversy over treatments, which drugs were pushed and which were dismissed.
And the source material really hones in on this dismissal of cheap, generic drugs in favor of expensive new ones.
Exactly. The source talks about a specific conversation where, for critically ill patients, near intubation, Dr. Fauci dismissed using high-dose IV steroids.
What did he say?
Essentially, we've tried that, implying it didn't work.
But the data later on told a completely different story.
A completely different story. It turns out those IV steroids, a generic called Salumidrol, were incredibly effective.
And a generic doesn't make a lot of money for pharmaceutical companies.
Precisely. This treatment provided a 36% reduction in death for ICU patients. That is a huge number.
So while this cheap, effective generic was available,
the drug that was being promoted and bought by the government was remdesivir. And the critics point out that it didn't work very well in trials and had serious side effects like kidney failure.
So the question the sources keep asking is why? Why sideline a proven cheap treatment for a new expensive one that's less effective?
And you see that same kind of, let's call it semantic dancing, around the gain-of-function research funding.
At the Wuhan lab, this was a huge controversy.
A huge one. And the sources allege that Dr. Fauci used very careful wording to deny funding it, even though the money flowed through an intermediary, EcoHealth.
And the experiments themselves were described in ways that, by any definition, were gain of function.
Right, so the critics say it comes down to a deliberate parsing of words to avoid accountability.
We see the same pattern with masks and distancing. Before 2020, the scientific consensus was against public masking. Even Fauci said not to wear them in early 2020.
And the problem was twofold. First, effectiveness. The cloth masks, their pores are just way bigger than the viral particles.
So they don't really work.
Not very well. And even N95s need these strict protocols that are, frankly, impossible for the public to maintain. You're supposed to throw them out after 4 hours.
But the bigger issue, according to the sources, was the false sense of security it created.
Exactly. Promoting cloth masks encouraged vulnerable people to take risks they shouldn't have. The source gives an example of an elderly person caring for their sick spouse, thinking that flimsy mask was protecting them,
And that connects to the 6-foot rule.
which critics say was just arbitrarily made up. It wasn't based on robust science at the time, and worse, it might have encouraged unsafe behavior.
Like a choir practice, thinking 6 feet is safe.
When, in an enclosed space, the virus can travel 30 or 40 feet. The whole narrative here is that objective science was often just discarded.
Okay, so if the data was clear, but the policy was wrong, that takes us right into part 2. The systems, the financial ecosystems, that allowed all this to happen.
It's a key connection. The sources draw a parallel between Dr. Fauci's long tenure and someone like J. Edgar Hoover.
Saying that staying in a powerful bureaucratic post for that long just inevitably leads to abuses of power.
And they point to specific accusations. There are emails where he allegedly tells people to take them down, referring to critics.
And even claims about destroying federal records. The instruction was supposedly read this and destroy it.
But to really understand the power, you have to follow the money.
Starting with compensation. Fauci's salary alone, it's what, $450,000?
Yeah, more than the president. And his wife is high up at the NIH in bioethics, so their combined income is around $700,000.
But the real structural issue the sources point to is the royalties.
This is a huge conflict of interest, and it's still being fought over in Congress.
How is it legal for government scientists, especially ones who approve vaccines, to get royalties from the drug companies they're regulating, like Pfizer?
It's all about a lack of disclosure. There's this ongoing fight to make those payments public. The sources claim that across the NIH, about 1,500 scientists received a staggering $1.5 billion in royalties.
$1.5 billion. I mean, regardless of intent, that kind of money creates a massive incentive.
A massive one. And it's compounded by the fact that drug manufacturers have no liability for vaccine injuries. That goes back to the Reagan administration.
So they have no financial risk. But on the other side, doctors have a huge financial incentive to administer them.
Right. The source gives a specific example of a small practice in Orange County. They were allegedly paid $1.5 million if they vaccinated their entire patient roster.
So it's basically exempt from the rules that prevent kickbacks to doctors.
In practice, yes. And this all connects to the risk-benefit analysis, especially for young people. The sources argue that for healthy kids, the risk of myocarditis, the heart inflammation...
It's actually greater than the risk from the virus itself. And it increases with more doses.
And there's an important clinical detail here. The critics argue that giving the vaccine close to a natural infection is especially dangerous because the immune system is already on high alert.
Okay, so let's shift from medical freedom to another kind of personal freedom. The fight over low-dose hemp and THC.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. The sources talk about a recent legislative effort to basically ban hemp products by setting the THC limit incredibly low, at 0.4 milligrams.
Which would just kill a $2 billion industry overnight.
Completely. And the historical parallel the source draws is fascinating. It's an echo of the original reefer madness craze.
From the 1930s.
That's right. And the source explains that moral panic wasn't really about morals. It was engineered by William Randolph Hearst, who owned paper mills, to eliminate hemp as a commercial competitor for paper.
So it was purely economic, just dressed up as a moral crusade.
Exactly. And the argument for freedom today is pretty simple. Adults use these low-dose products for real health reasons, sleep, anxiety, even for kids with severe seizures.
The sources frame it as a personal choice, pointing out the absurdity of allowing drugs like Ambien, but banning THC gummies.
Which brings us neatly to part 3, looking at these bigger structural economic policies, starting with the border and welfare.
Now, the source material here presents a very controversial argument. It frames the border situation not as a humanitarian failure, but as a calculated political strategy.
The argument from the critics is that it's driven by power politics. The premise is that 2 out of 3 new immigrants will eventually vote Democrat, making it a project to shift the country's demographic balance.
And they argue this has created more opportunity for things like welfare fraud.
Yeah, there's a specific example cited from Minnesota alleging widespread fraud where Somali immigrants supposedly misused the welfare system through fake learning centers.
And there's a striking detail. The TSA flagged nearly $700 million in declared cash leaving the Minneapolis airport over just 2 years.
But to be fair, the source adds some necessary nuance. They contrast that with the Hmong community in Minnesota, who have much lower welfare dependence and higher rates of success.
So it's complex. It's about culture, work ethic, the reasons for immigrating.
Right, and the pragmatic solution proposed for long-term illegal workers, say a carpenter who's been here 20 years, is a work program.
So they can work legally, but no welfare, no citizenship, no voting.
Exactly. The source argues 80% of those workers would take that deal in a heartbeat.
Okay, moving to the macroeconomy. There's this extraordinary financial mechanism that critics say is making the national debt worse.
You're talking about the Federal Reserve paying interest on bank reserve.
Let's unpack that because it's crucial. Before 2008, this didn't happen. Now it does. What's the impact?
It creates a massive, risk-free profit center for big banks. Last year alone, the Fed paid them $187 billion just to let their money sit there doing nothing.
$187 billion. And that money used to go back to the Treasury to help offset the debt.
That's right. So critics say we are actively making the national debt about 10% worse than it needs to be each year.
And it discourages lending. Why would a bank risk lending to a small business if they can get 4% risk-free just by parking their cash at the Fed? It keeps rates high for everyone.
This idea of distorted financial signals connects right to the critique of something like rent control.
You mean setting an artificial price, like a $300 apartment in Manhattan?
Exactly. The sources argue the quality of that apartment will go to ruin because the landlord has no incentive to maintain it, and it ultimately creates shortages. It's a classic example of why socialist policies fail.
So finally, let's talk about welfare reform. The deficit is framed as a bipartisan problem.
A dirty deal, really. Military hawks on one side, welfare spending advocates on the other, both drive huge spending growth.
And the proposed solution is something called the penny plan.
It's a gradual, across-the-board cut, just 1% from everything. Military and welfare every year for 5 years. The idea is it's small enough to be politically possible, but it forces everyone to share the burden.
There's also a more targeted idea for food stamps, for SNAP.
Yeah, to limit what you can buy with them, to exclude things like sugary drinks, chips, candy.
It's estimated that about 10% of food stamp money goes to sugary drinks alone.
And this isn't framed as punishment. It's tough love. The idea is that better health leads to independence. People weighed down by poor nutrition just don't have the energy to pursue work.
The source is firm on this. Work is a reward, not a punishment, and it should be tied to benefits for those who are able-bodied.
And on a final, more optimistic note, the sources really push back against the dystopian idea that AI is going to eliminate all jobs.
Right. I mean, historically, automation has always created more jobs than it destroyed. The loom, electricity.
And the data shows there's still great income mobility in the U.S. A big chunk of people from the bottom 20% move up to the top 20%. The conclusion is that humans will always find ways to be productive and creative.
So we've really covered this collision of science, bureaucratic power, and financial interest today. The core pattern seems to be how easily a consensus can be built that just runs contrary to data or common sense.
If you take one thing from this deep dive, it should be the value of asking those simple questions. What's the financial incentive here? Why were cheap treatments ignored? What happens when power goes unchecked for decades?
Here is a provocative thought for you to chew on. If the Federal Reserve is paying big banks $187 billion a year in interest, worsening the debt and discouraging lending, what specific, actionable regulatory change could you lobby your representatives to demand to stop that flow of money immediately and force that cash back into the Treasury? Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.